If you ask someone what is the most important, most prestigious, most historic rivalry in Test cricket, they'll say the Ashes. And they'll be right. But we can confidently say the second most important, the second most prestigious rivalry in modern Test cricket, without a doubt, is India versus Australia. The matches become even spicier when it's India traveling to Australia. The rivalry has a lot of history, and in the wake of upcoming Border Gavaskar Trophy in Australia, this is as good a time as any to look back at this rivalry that has quickly become one of the fiercest, most lucrative rivalry in modern cricket. So, let's go! Consider subscribing to our channel. It's free and helps us a ton. Thanks. As we said, the India-Australia competitions are spicier when India travels to Australia. So for the sake of this video, we are restricting ourselves to India touring Australia. It also fits the current context of India touring Australia. That's why we are not going as far as back to 1935 when Australia toured the Indian subcontinent and played some 17 first-class matches, including 4 unofficial test matches against India. We also want this video to be concise. So we will restrict this video to the series played after the establishment of the now famous Border Gavaskar Trophy. So yeah, we are not going back to India's first tour of Australia in 1947. But do let us know if you want us to dive deep into the history and make a video on it. That's a history of 50 test matches right there. Speaking of Border Gavaskar Trophy, it's really not as old as the rivalry itself. The first Border Gavaskar Trophy series was actually just a one-off test in Delhi. But as we said, we are talking about India going to Australia, and for that, we have to go all the way back to 1999 when India toured Australia for a 3-test series. Now, you have to remember that playing Australia around this time was not an easy task. The world champion Australia were coming off a comfortable clean sweep, a 3-0 test series win over Pakistan at home, while India under Sachin Tendulkar were rocked by match-fixing allegations, especially Mohammad Azharuddin, who was left out of the touring squad. The chairman of Indian selection committee at the time, Chandu Borde, later clarified that Azharuddin's exclusion was due to the focus on youth and not the scandal itself. India's record in Australia at the time was abysmal, having won only 3 and losing 16 of the 25 tests till then. In fact, India away from home were just not a good team at all. Despite Steve Waugh's shaky start as the test captain of Australia at the time, they were expected to clean sweep India. India were not considered good enough to beat Australia in Australia, and even the captain Sachin echoed the sentiment by saying that they were just hoping to do well. The series went as expected. Australia wiping the floor with India, whitewashing them comprehensively 3-0. Australia dominated the series in every aspect. 4 Aussie batsmen averaged over 50 in the series, with Ricky Ponting being particularly in devastating form, scoring 375 runs in 5 innings at an average of 125 with 200s and a 50. Justin Langer, who struggled for form through the series, ended up scoring a double hundred in Sydney. 223 of his 289 runs in the series coming in one single innings. Steve Waugh and Adam Gilchrist were the other 2 batsmen to end up with an average of over 50 in the series. The only Indian batsman to have any sort of impact on the series was Sachin Tendulkar, who scored 278 runs at an average of 46.33 with 100 and 250s. There were also some umpiring controversies, especially the way Sachin was given out in both the innings in the first test, particularly the second innings LBW. Kind of foreshadowing what was to happen between India and Australia down the line, huh? The bowling was equally dominated by the Aussies. Glenn McGrath was at his usual best with 18 wickets at 13.77 apiece. But the real sensation was the debuting Brett Lee, who picked 13 wickets in the 2 tests he played. Touted as the fastest bowler in the world, he ripped through the Indian batting multiple times. Indian bowlers proved to be completely ineffective, with only one frontline bowler in Ajit Agarkar averaging less than 40. Apart from the first morning of the first test in Adelaide, Indian bowlers were never ever felt like putting Aussies under any pressure. Javagal Srinath, Venkatesh Prasad, Anil Kumble all failed. Nevertheless, from an Indian perspective, this series was memorable for two specific batting performances. One, VVS Lakshman's fantastic innings of 167 at the SCG in the third test, and second, Ajit Agarkar's 5 ducks on the trot in 6 balls, which included 4 consecutive first bowlers. Australia won all the 3 test matches by huge margins. They won the Adelaide test by 285 runs, the Melbourne test by 180 runs, and the final test in Sydney by an innings and 141 runs. To say it was a complete and utter destruction would be an understatement. India's next tour down under was 4 years later in 2003 and proved to be one of the most important chapters in not only the Border Gavaskar Trophy's history but Indian cricket history. Now, without any context, the result of the series would tell you that this was merely a great contest between two top test-playing nations. But that's just part of why the series was special. At this point in history, Australia were a nigh unbeatable team in all forms of cricket, but especially Test cricket. Between 14th October 1999 and 27th February 2001, Australia won 16 consecutive Test matches that included the India Test series we just talked about. You know who stopped that victory train? Of course you do. It was stopped by India in what is the most famous Test win in Indian cricket history at the Eden Gardens. Now that whole series deserves its own video, so do let us know if you want us to make one. But it suffices to say that the only team that challenged the Aussie domination of cricket at the time was India. So much so that when Steve Waugh landed in India for that series, he called India the final frontier, having not won a Test series in India for 32 years. But beating Australia in India is one thing. Beating Australia in Australia was just another kettle of fish. You simply did not beat Australia in Australia, let alone beat. You couldn't draw a Test series in Australia. Since 1994, Australia had failed to win only one Test series at home, a 0-0 drawn series against New Zealand. India were given a glimmer of hope, a lifeline if you will, as McGrath had to sit out of the series due to an ankle injury, while Shane Warne was serving a 12-month suspension due to doping allegations. Still, even in their absence, Australia shouldn't be sweating this Sourav Ganguly-led Indian side, right? The first test at Brisbane set the tone for entirety of the series. On a green, fast and bouncy pitch, Australia was supposed to make light work of this Indian side. However, the rain-affected test saw India fight tooth and nail for their pound of flesh, and the fight was led by the captain himself, Sourav Ganguly. After Indian seamers, especially Zaheer Khan, led a collapse of the Aussie first innings, restricting them to 323 after being 268 for 2 at one point, Sourav Ganguly, a man woefully out of form for some time in Test cricket, scored a blistering 144 to dig India out of a hole from 62 for 3 to 409. Taking a lead against the Aussie team was a huge achievement, and while the test ended in a draw due to the aforementioned rain, what it showed was India were ready to fight Australia in their own yard. And then Adelaide happened. The way the Adelaide test began on a nice batting-friendly pitch, it did not look like Australia could be stopped. They scored 400 on the first day of the test, something very rare in Test cricket even today. The first innings total of 556, led by a Ricky Ponting double 100, would usually put enough pressure on Indian teams' batting to collapse. And after a good start, it felt India were back to its old ways, reduced to 85 for 4 in the first innings. However, the duo from Kolkata, Dravid and Lakshman, responsible for one of the greatest Test match victories of all time, combined together again to lead India to a fighting 523. Dravid went on to score 233, one of the greatest innings by an Indian ever, while Lakshman complimented him with his own 148. They combined for a 303 runs partnership. Now, you would imagine that when two teams post 500 plus totals in the first innings, the match would probably end in a draw. Instead, another unsung hero of the Indian bowling attack showed up, picking up 6 of the Australia's wickets in the second innings. Yep, Ajit Agarkar's 6 for 41 triggered a second innings collapse as Australia crashed from 183 for 5 to 196. Despite such heroics, it wasn't guaranteed that India would win their first test in Australia since 1981. So who did it for India then? If your guess was Rahul Dravid, you guessed it right. Rahul Dravid, the hero of the first innings, once again came to India's aid on the final day of the test as India kept chipping away at the target with Dravid holding the fort on one end. India did the unthinkable, beating Australia by 4 wickets. India had gone 1-0 up in the test series against all odds. The good feelings did not last as India came crashing down in Melbourne, losing the test by 9 wickets. After a fantastic start on the first day of the test, aided by a blistering 195 by Sehwag, India's first innings collapsed from 350 for 4 to 366. On the other hand, Indian bowlers just could not contain the Aussie batting as they scored a mammoth 558. Matthew Hayden scored a fantastic 136, but it was Ricky Ponting's 257 that shut India out completely. To show a brave face and kind of protect an out-of-form Sachin, Ganguly promoted himself ahead of him, and Dravid, Sachin and Ganguly combined to lead Indian fight back in the second innings. At one point, India were 253 for 4, and on a deteriorating MCG track, it felt like any sort of lead in excess of 150 could spell trouble for Australia. But Brad Williams ripped through the Indian middle and lower order to finish India for 286, and Australia equalized the series 1-all. The action moved to Sydney as the fate of an exhilarating test series hanged in the balance. The lack of McGrath and Shane Warne in the Aussie attack was never more apparent than in this match. India went on to score their highest test score at the time, a whopping 705 on the back of Sachin Tendulkar's 241 not out, his personal best at the time. Sachin Tendulkar, who was out of form for most of the series and was constantly getting out edging behind, pledged to not play a single cover drive. He scored 33 boundaries in his innings and not a single one was through the covers. He later explained, "I had got out a couple of times to balls bowled outside the off stump, so I decided not to play the cover drive. They were bowling consistently outside the off stump and I decided to leave all those balls. Then they had to bowl to me and I used the pace of the ball." Sachin's incredible discipline led to what could be called one of the greatest innings played by an Indian in Australia. Lakshman's love-in with the Aussie bowling continued as he scored his second 100 of the series, scoring 178 and forging a 353-run partnership with Sachin. In reply, Aussies themselves got to 474 with the help of Justin Langer and Simon Catich hundreds. Kumble took 8 wickets in the innings, his best bowling figures away from home. Instead of enforcing the follow-on, India batted again, scoring as quickly as they can to try and force a result, ending up with 211 for 2 in just over 40 overs. Australia were set a target of 443 in just about a day's play. History for India beckoned on the final day. Through the final day, India kept chipping away, and when Ricky Ponting got out in the 56th over of the Aussie innings, India had hope of doing the unthinkable. But Steve Waugh, playing in his final test innings, scored a staunch 80 and steered Australia to safety. The series ended in a draw, but it was clear that despite the Aussie supremacy on Test cricket, India were truly here as a force to be reckoned with, even away from home. The drawn series allowed India to retain the Border Gavaskar Trophy that they had won at home. Rahul Dravid was rightly named the player of the series for scoring 619 runs at an average of 123.8 with 100, which was a double 100, and 350s. He cemented his legacy as one of the best batsmen ever produced by India. For Australia, Ricky Ponting was by far the best batsman, scoring 706 runs at an average of 100.85, which included 2 double hundreds. This wasn't a series for the bowlers though, as bowlers from both the sides largely struggled to stem the flow of runs. Only one bowler across both the teams averaged less than 30 in the series, and that was Anil Kumble, who took 24 wickets in the 3 tests he played at 29.58 apiece. Sourav Ganguly got a lot of praise for instilling the steel and fighting spirit through his captaincy, while VVS Lakshman remained a thorn in the Aussie side by scoring big whenever India needed him in the series. India's next tour to Australia was the 2007-8 series, and it's touted as one of the most controversial series ever. Before this, Australia had conquered the final frontier, having beaten India 2-1 in the 2004-5 series in India. Australia continued to be the best team in the world in all formats, while India were a decent team who were still trying to be consistent as a test team. After the series lost to Australia at home, they regrouped under Dravid, who even won a test series in England, which was a huge deal. Nevertheless, Australia were coming into the series winning 14 tests in a row, close to equaling and beating their own record of 16 test wins in a row, while India had won 3 consecutive test series against Bangladesh, England and Pakistan coming into the series. Ponting was leading a near-invincible team, while Kumble was bringing a team who were capable of reaching great heights. Yet the test series began in the most unpredictably predictable fashion, with India crumbling at Melbourne under 4 days. India just never were in the game, as they crashed to a huge 337 runs defeat. With Sehwag being out of picture due to poor form, Dravid was forced to open, and it did not go well for India, crumbling to just 196 in reply to Australia's first innings score of 343. Australia did even better in the second innings, setting India an almost impossible target of 499, but India never came close. Matthew Hayden's first innings 100 earned him the Man of the Match award. Australia were now just 1 test away from equaling the record of the most number of test wins on the trot. However, nobody could have guessed what was going to happen next. The action moved to Sydney, a ground where India have had some of their most fond memories. This one, however, turned into a nightmare almost from the get-go. First was the umpiring. This test is infamous for some of the strangest, howler-ridden umpiring decisions of all time, and it began on the very first day itself. Australia won the toss and decided to bat, but India were off to a flyer, getting both Phil Jakes and Matthew Hayden early. They would have gotten Ponting too when he was on 17, when he had edged one behind around his legs, but umpire Mark Benson ruled him not out. Well, the umpiring howlers kept going, as Ricky Ponting was later adjudged LBW for 55 to Harbhajan when he had inside edged the ball onto his pads. The biggest beneficiary of the umpiring howlers on the first day though was Andrew Symonds. Symonds had walked in when Australia were in a spot of bother at 119 for 4, which soon became 134 for 6. Symonds got to work, rebuilding the Aussie innings, but when he was at 30, he edged the ball behind of the bowling of Ishant Sharma. Steve Buckner ruled it not out, and Symonds continued. Australia at the time were 193 for 6, and it does stand to reason that Symonds' wicket at the point would have had a huge impact. Not long after, Symonds got another reprieve, this time from the third umpire, as an appeal for stumping was ruled out, though the replay suggested Symonds wasn't back in the crease. Symonds was 48 at the time, and Australia 238 for 6. The umpiring howlers continued into the second day when Symonds, who had scored his second Test 100, was not even referred to the third umpire by Steve Buckner on an appeal for stumping. The replay suggested he hadn't dragged his foot back in time. By that time, Symonds was already on 148. This allowed Symonds to pull Australia back in the game. He combined with Brad Hogg, who scored 79, and Brett Lee, who scored 59, to pull Australia to a big total of 463. Symonds ended up unbeaten on 162, his career highest score. The umpiring mistakes continued into the Indian innings when Wasim Jaffer was bowled off a Brett Lee Yorker, which was seemingly a no ball, but the umpire Mark Benson did not catch it, and it was not even conclusive to begin with. The next 2 wrong decisions went into India's favour for a change. Lakshman was given not out on an LBW appeal of Brett Lee's bowling when he was 16. He went on to score 109. Sachin too was beneficiary of a close LBW appeal being turned down when he was at 36. The surprising part was the decision came from Steve Buckner. He went on to score an unbeaten 154. India fought back valiantly with the help of hundreds from Lakshman and Sachin and excellent 50s from Ganguly and Harbhajan as India scored 532 and took a crucial lead of 69. The umpiring howlers kept coming as Hussey was adjudged not out twice on seemingly straightforward LBW decisions. Once of the bowling of Kumble when he was on 22 and once of the bowling of RP Singh when he was on 45. He went on to score an unbeaten 145 and the Aussies declared on 401. Matthew Hayden too scored 100 while Simon scored a 50. Australia had set India a target of 333 on the final day of minimum of 72 overs, a run rate of over 4 required if India wanted to win it. On a deteriorating 5th day SCG pitch, it felt like the target was a bit too steep and India would be better off playing for a draw. Tony Greig even felt that the Aussie declaration came a bit too late. But this proved to be the day that the umpiring errors really came under scrutiny. India did not start well as Jaffer, Lakshman and Tendulkar had all gone relatively cheaply, reducing India to 54 for 3 by the 18th over. Dravid as an opener wasn't having a great series till then, but he dug deep and in partnership with Sourav Ganguly, who was playing his 100th test, began to steer India to safety. But just when it felt like that Dravid and Ganguly were taking the sting out of the Aussie bowling, disaster struck. Or more precisely, Steve Buckner struck as Dravid was adjudged caught behind on a ball that was nowhere close to his bat. On replays, it clearly showed Dravid's bat tucked behind his pads and ball merely deflected off the pad to Gilchrist. Dravid's valiant innings ended at 38. The next decision, however, proved to be the biggest controversy of the test. Ganguly edged a ball behind to the slips that was seemingly caught by Michael Clarke. However, umpire Mark Benson was unsure if the ball was caught cleanly, but in one of the most bizarre display of umpiring, instead of going to the third umpire or consulting with his fellow umpire, he asked the fielding team and their captain Ricky Ponting, who signalled out, and thus Ganguly was ruled out. Ganguly was batting at 51 at the time and his wicket meant India were reduced to 137 for 6 in the 41st over. With still 30 odd overs to bat, Dhoni and Kumble dug deep, batting over 20 overs before Dhoni got out to Simons. However, the captain kept his cool and kept batting. Kumble and Harbhajan had brought India to the brink of a draw. With 2 overs and 3 wickets remaining, everyone thought the draw was inevitable. But Michael Clarke had other plans. In what was only his second over in the innings, Clarke ripped through the Indian lower order, picking Harbhajan, RP Singh and Ishant Sharma in space of 5 balls. India were bowled out for 210 with just a minimum of 7 balls left in the day's play. Kumble was left stranded at 45. Australia won their 16th test in a row, equaling their previous record, and in the process had also retained the Border Gavaskar Trophy with still 2 tests remaining. But all of this became a footnote in the bigger saga that unfolded after the test. First of all, the umpiring angered the Indians to no end. On the receiving end of 8 of the 11 notable wrong decisions, Indians felt that they were hardened by what was a very poor performance from umpires as a collective, including the third umpire. India was specifically upset by the performance of Steve Buckner and wanted him removed from the third test. Anil Kumble even refused to shake hands with the umpires after the match and expressed their discontent by boycotting the post-match ceremony. In an on-ground interview after the match, Anil Kumble summed up his view of the game by stating, "Only one team is playing in the spirit of the game." And that was the other part of India's discontent in the test, the conduct of the Aussie team itself. Now, the Australian team had already had a reputation of being sledgers on the field, playing hard and gaining advantage through quote-unquote mental disintegration of the opposition team. But in this test, there were several instances of them being flat out unsportsmanlike, like Ponting and Simons not walking after clearly having edged the ball, or Michael Clarke refusing to walk, even standing his ground after clearly edging the ball to the slips till the umpire gave him out. or when Ponting claimed a catch of Dhoni despite clearly having grasped it, which was eventually adjudged not out by the third umpire. The final straw was the dismissal of Ganguly on the final day, specifically how it was given and how the Aussies claimed a catch that was presumably not clean. But even more importantly, how Ponting held up his finger to signal to the umpires that the catch was clean. The media was ruthless. The Aussie camp was adamant that they played hard but fair. Ponting was particularly upset by the Indian journalists for questioning his integrity. Indian commentators and analysts on the air at the time were super critical of how the test was played. Harsha Bhogle, commentating for Star Cricket at the time, said at the end of the match, "Australia won, but did they deserve it?" Sunil Gavaskar was way more scathing in his commentary. On Ganguly's dismissal, he said, "Why is Mr. Benson asking a person who did not walk off when he was caught behind at 14? And it couldn't be possible that you were lying when you were batting and true while you're fielding. That is nonsense, utter nonsense. I'm sorry, Mr. Benson, you got it all wrong." But this is not where it ended either. In fact, it only escalated when Harbhajan was reported to the match referee on the charge of, quote, using language or gestures that offends, insults, humiliates, intimidates, threatens, disparages or vilifies another person on the basis of that person's race, religion, gender, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. In a hearing after the test, match referee Mike Proctor heard testimonies of both sides. On the Aussie side, Hayden, Simons, Ponting and Gilchrist gave testimonies, while on the Indian side were Harbhajan and Tendulkar, who was batting with Harbhajan at the time this incident happened. Proctor subsequently banned Harbhajan for 3 tests. In his final report, Proctor said, "I believe one group is telling the truth," implying that Tendulkar and Harbhajan were lying on the report. This further angered the Indians. Gavaskar was yet again scathing in his remarks. He was skeptical of Ricky Ponting's motives behind reporting Harbhajan to the match officials, as Harbhajan had gotten Ponting out 3 times thus far in the series. In his newspaper column to Hindustan Times, Gavaskar wrote, "Millions of Indians want to know if it was a white man taking the white man's word against that of the brown man. Quite simply, if there was no audio evidence, nor did the officials hear anything, then the charge did not stand. This is what has incensed the millions of Indians who are flabbergasted that the word of one of the greatest players in the history of the game, Sachin Tendulkar, was not accepted. In effect, Tendulkar has been branded a liar by the match referee. The off-spinner has denied having used the word which has caused offense, and in the absence of any audio recording, and most crucially, with both umpires not having heard it, the charge should have been dropped straight away for lack of corroborating evidence. By accepting the word of the Australian players and not the Indian players, the match referee has exposed himself to the charge of taking a decision based not on facts, but on emotion. India lodged their own complaint against Brad Hogg for sledging and calling the Indian captain Anil Kumble and the vice-captain MS Dhoni bastards. On 7th January 2008, the BCCI announced that they were suspending the tour pending the outcome of the appeal against Harbhajan's ban. The BCCI in India issued a statement in which they decided to challenge the unfair decision to suspend Harbhajan Singh, stating that the ban was patently unfair. However, ICC mediated between the two teams as India decided to go ahead with the tour. This also led to the charges being dropped against Brad Hogg. The reaction outside of India was also not great towards the Aussie team. While Cricket Australia and some former players backed their team, a significant portion of the media criticized the Aussie conduct. Geoff Lawson, former player and later a coach and commentator, told Herald Sun, "There's certainly been a lot of feeling from ex-players who think the baggy green has been disrespected. Some of these current players need to be spoken to. I just think a bit of counselling needs to be done with how these players perceive themselves. As an ex-Australian player, I was pretty disappointed." The English journalist and former captain of Somerset County Cricket Club, Peter Roebuck, a columnist for Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, branded Ponting as arrogant and insisted that he be stripped of the captaincy. Steve Waugh, writing for the Daily Telegraph, said, "It's a real pity this magnificent test match will probably be remembered for all the wrong reasons and not for the outstanding quality, pressure and the excruciating drama it ultimately provided." He further said that the affair now has the potential to affect relationships between the countries. In the aftermath of everything that happened, Steve Bucknor was removed from officiating any further in the test series and was replaced by Billy Bowden. 12 years after this test match in Sydney, umpire Steve Buckner agreed that his two mistakes might have cost India dearly. He said, "Mistake 1, which happened when India were doing well, allowed an Australian batsman to get 100. Mistake 2 on day 5 might have cost India the game, but still, that 2 mistakes over 5 days. Was I the first umpire to make 2 mistakes in a test? Still, those 2 mistakes seem to have haunted me." Harbhajan was later acquitted of the racism charge and had his 3-match ban lifted, though he was still fined 50% of his match fee for using abusive language. ICC Appeals Commissioner Judge John Hansen ruled a lack of sufficient evidence. Unlike Mike Proctor, who thought Tendulkar was not in a position to hear what was said, Hansen said extensive video footage establishes that Tendulkar was within earshot and could have heard the words. According to Hansen, video replays from various camera angles showed that Tendulkar was the closest player to the conversation and was likely to have heard it. The ICC mediation and meeting of the two captains eased the tension between the two teams as the focus was finally allowed to shift back to cricket on the field rather off it. To this day, Wakhar's pitch is considered the fastest and the bounciest pitch in the world, so after India arrived there, very few people gave them a chance. Perth was seen as the most difficult place to visit for any team, let alone a team from the Indian subcontinent. 2-0 down, the whole Sydney fiasco still lingering in the air that put the entire series in jeopardy. There were not many believers of India. To make matters seemingly worse, Australia included Sean Tate in their side, who was considered the fastest bowler in the world at the time. An attack that had Brett Lee, Mitchell Johnson and Sean Tate? Well, India was cooked, right? India realized that the Dravid as an opener experiment wasn't working, so they decided to recall Sehwag after he had scored 100 against ACT Invitational 11 in a practice match between the second and the third test. Australia were looking to break the record of 16 consecutive test match wins. India were just looking to survive. Well, India did more than survive. Winning the toss, India made their best start of the series even if Jaffer continued his horrid form. However, in the space of 3 overs, India went from 57 for no loss to 59 for 2. That's when the two maestros of Indian batting, Sachin and Dravid, combined for a magnificent partnership of 139. Sachin missed out on his second 100 of the series, getting out for 93, while Dravid scored 71. A late order collapse saw India go from 328 for 6 to 330 all out on the second morning, seemingly ceding the advantage that they had gained on the first day. But for the first time in the series, Indian bowlers came to the party. Irfan Pathan ripped through the opening pair, getting both Phil Jake and Chris Rogers early, while RP Singh got Michael Hussey, leaving Australia teetering at 14 for 3. It soon became 61 for 5 when Ishant Sharma picked Ricky Ponting and Michael Clarke next. As had been the norm in the series, Andrew Symonds came to the rescue along with Adam Gilchrist, who forged a 102-run partnership in quick time. However, Andrew Symonds edged one behind to Dravid to become Anil Kumble's 600th test wicket, only the third bowler at the time to cross the milestone. Aussie lower order couldn't really survive for long as they went from 192 for 6 to 212 all out. For the first time in this test series, India held the advantage. The wicket remained a pacey, bouncy and a challenge to contend with throughout the third day as India laboured to press home the advantage. Sehwag proved to be a worthy inclusion with the scores of 29 and 43 in the test, while Irfan Pathan earned himself a promotion up the order and proved his worth, scoring a calm 46. Despite that, India were reeling at 160 for 6 at one point, and with the lead at 278, India needed their middle and lower order to dig deep. Well, when you're in trouble in Australia, who do you turn to? Yep, VVS Lakshman. Lakshman forged a 75-run partnership with Dhoni and then batted around with the tail to guide India to 294. He got good support from RP Singh too. Sean Tate, who was specifically selected to instill the fear of pace in the Indian batsmen, had a disappointing match, picking up no wickets and ended up only bowling 21 overs across the 2 innings. Stuart Clark was the pick of the bowlers with 4 wickets in the second innings, while Brett Lee picked 7 in the match. set a target of 412, Australia lost both the openers to Pathan again and ended the day on 65 for 2, still needing 347 runs. India were on the verge of a miracle, but Australia had Ponting and Hussey in the middle. The fourth morning of the test saw one of the best spells of fast bowling ever by an Indian pacer. Ponting and Hussey had to dig deep under some overcast conditions as Ishant Sharma bowled a dream spell, especially to Ponting, constantly beating him on both outside and inside edge and troubling him throughout the spell. The now infamous line of Sehwag, "Ek aur karega," asking Ishant to bowl one more over after already having bowled a long spell, brought about the downfall of Ponting. That was Ishant's 8th over of that spell. India kept chipping away at the Aussie batting, and at the fall of Michael Clarke's wicket, it was truly over, as Australia were teetering at 253 for 8, still 159 runs away from the target. Seeing no other alternative, Mitchell Johnson and Stuart Clark decided to go after the Indian bowling, and for some time it felt like maybe they'll be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat. Johnson scored a 50, but the second new ball did the job for the Indians as Australia folded for 340. India had done the unthinkable again, beating Australia in one of the most difficult places to play against them. Not only that, India stopped Australia from going beyond the record of most consecutive test wins again. Irfan Pathan showed some great all-round capabilities, scoring 74 runs and picking 5 wickets in the test, rightfully earning the Man of the Match award. The quality of cricket through the match was quite high, and after Sydney, the Perth test was played in rather great spirits. The Indian and Australian contingent moved to Adelaide for the fourth and final test of this absorbing, highly controversial test series. Despite no chance of India regaining the Border Gavaskar Trophy, India still had a chance to equalize the series. However, a series that had thus far produced some of the most exhilarating cricket closed out in a whimper on a batting paradise. Wasim Jafar's form meant India once again experimented with the opening position, replacing him with Harbhajan while asking Irfan Pathan to open the batting with Sehwag. That was a huge ask for the young all-rounder, and it proved to be so, who scored 9 and a duck in his 2 innings. India's first innings saw Sachin Tendulkar scoring his second 100 of the series, a magnificent 153. He held the innings together for the most part. Lakshman contributed with a 50, but it was Kumble and Harbhajan who allowed India to go past 500. Kumble scored 87 while Harbhajan scored 63. India ended their first innings at 526. Australia in reply rode the hundreds from Hayden, Ponting and Michael Clarke, scoring 563. Hayden scored his third 100 of the series, while Ponting finally scored 100 after having an indifferent series. The bowlers suffered the most, as 7 bowlers from both the teams combined conceded over 100 runs in an innings in this test. India's second innings was largely a Sehwag show. He scored a blistering 151 and, combined with his 63 from the first innings, announced his return to form and test cricket. India declared the second innings at 269 for 7 as the test petered out in a drab draw. Brett Lee was named the man of the series with 24 wickets at 22.58 apiece. For India, Kumble took the most wickets, claiming 20. Sachin Tendulkar top scored the series with 493 runs at an average of 70.42 with 200s and 250s, while Matthew Hayden and Andrew Symonds scored the most runs for Aussies, 410 runs at an average of 82 with 300s and 68.33 with 100 and 250s respectively. Now we can continue on with the next tour of India to Australia. I mean, there are so many of them still left, but we wanted to keep this video short and concise, and even then, this is already quite long. So we will leave these tours for the next part. In the meantime, India in Australia again. So we will be tuned in to see how that goes. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe and comment for more content like this. This is Cricket Archives.